Recording. Okay, hey everybody. How you doing? Let's have a conversation about your final assignments while we have a moment. I was going to, apparently this week and next week are the class evaluations. They do it differently now. They do it online. You guys done it already? So I don't want to do it today. Do it next week. Yeah, so I was supposed to give you like 10 minutes to go online and do it. You can do it yourself. I don't know what the big deal is. Let's talk about your assignments instead. So this year is a commentary paper, as you probably noticed. And we've done this in other years as well. And it works fairly well. And a couple of students have come to talk to me about the assignments already, as I hope you will too. Catherine, the PhD student TA, will be marking them, and she's pretty rough. So do a good job, and if things go poorly, of course, I will remark them. But I've instructed her along the same lines, which I'm going to describe to you what my expectations are. Undergrads have this tendency in a written assignment to just try to impress the professor, in this case me, with how much stuff you know. I don't care what you know. What I care about is what is your opinion on a matter, and can you express that opinion cogently to the point where I'm convinced that your opinion is correct. You don't have to be right. You just have to put forth a convincing argument. So focus less on a data dump and more on creating an argument to have a point, which is important. Means it's important to have a thesis or a topic for your paper. It's not simply enough to say, I'm writing about diabetes and have like 2/3 about what diabetes is. And finally, diabetes is, I've actually had that paper in the past. It's like, grade 12 level stuff submitted a fourth-year paper. And guaranteed someone here is going to do that. Guaranteed, because the last minute you're going to forget. You have a paper due, and you're going to reproduce something you did in first year. It's not what I want. We're looking for something, hopefully, that is of publication quality. In the past, we've had 2 or 3 papers that have gone on to become published. So I want you to aim for that standard. If you want to know what I'm talking about, go to the highest stand would be Lancet Global Health. Go to the kinds of commentary papers they have published. Aim for that quality, knowing you won't reach that quality. And then, but an accessible quality would be something like Health Inquiry Journal. That's a journal put out by the University of Toronto, graduate students. It's entirely accessible. We've had students published there as well, all commentaries. So what a commentary paper isn't a full investigation of an issue. It isn't a full exploration of a topic. It's simply a call to action. Historically, when people publish commentaries, they're experts in the field. So the journal would call upon Dr. such and such, who is known to be the expert on organ transplantation. Say, Dr. such and such, what do you think is the most important thing we need to do to improve organ transplantation uptake in North America? And you'd say, well, I think the 3 most important things are this, and this. But there is a room for non-experts to contribute in this field as well, if you have passion and a deep interest in something. I've published lots of commentary papers on things I am not an expert on. The trick is to have a good writing style and a sense of what you want people to do. At the end of reading your commentary, I should feel inspired and motivated to do the thing that you want me to do. Again, you don't have to be right. You just have to make a convincing argument. So you can write a standard 5-paragraph essay on this, which is the easiest thing to do. And that would be something like opening paragraph about setting the stage, giving the reader just enough information to understand why you're asking the research question or presenting your thesis. And the next 2, 3, 4 paragraphs are arguments to be made in support of that thesis. And finally, you end off on a general theme. Right? So the trick to this is to be specific. Specific about exactly what you want people to do, the population you're looking at, and who needs to do something. So outrage is one thing. You can say something needs to be done about Aboriginal education. Okay, great. Who needs to do it? Where does it need to be done? And what needs to be done? And be specific again. There's an art and science to this. The science, as I mentioned, is organizing it appropriately, making sure there's one argument per paragraph, and making sure that every paragraph has a topic, making sure that every topic relates to the overall thesis, making sure there's a thesis. The art is the harder thing, and that's the skill that I want you to develop. This will serve you well in your career going forward. The art is twofold. One is using the appropriate language and choosing the right arguments and putting them in the right order and having it flow, etc. It's also in being strategic in fending off criticism. So this is why being specific helps. If you say, I'm going to talk about heart transplantation in Ohio in the 1990s and why the economic conditions are important, whatever. I'd say, well, what about kidney transplantation? Well, I'm not talking about kidney, I'm talking about heart. Right? So being strategic on how you narrow things down to fend off criticism is an important part of the art of science writing. I know it's asking a fair amount from people who've not been trained for this. In a health sciences career, we don't teach you how to write and to communicate, but it's important that at some point in your education you're exposed to a strategic kind of science writing, and this is the way that the regular world works. The world will never ask you, tell me everything you know about diabetes ever again. And again, I should bring in examples of what I don't like and what I do like, but then the problem with examples of what I do like is people always try to copy that, sentence per sentence. What I don't like, again, is the brochure. And every year someone gives me a brochure, like they forget to do the assignment. And here's everything I know about prostate cancer. No. Starting from base principles. Cancer is a mutation of the cell. I know. So your audience, remember, is going to be educated non-specialists. Someone like me, right? Whoever's going to read the journal in which your paper hopefully one day gets published in, may not be an expert on your field, but they'll be some of the science background. You don't have to start from zero principles. You start from someone who reads the paper regularly, understands scientific terms, okay? And have a call to action. Some people struggle with finding the right call to action, and this is your opportunity to be creative and to be innovative. And in general, there are three ways to be innovative. The hardest way is the one that we always talk about the most, and we assume that that's what people expect of us, and that's to pull a genuine gem out of your ass. It happens every 50,000 years. Like, I need to get from here to that place over there. I'll build a wheel. Smog, you're a genius. What's this wheel you speak of? Well, it's round and it rolls. Right? Every 50,000 years we have this magical thing we think of. That's the hardest and most basic form of innovation. The second form of innovation is taking two separate things and bringing them together in a creative fashion. Like, I like to walk. I like to listen to music. I know, the Sony Walkman, where I can walk around and travel with my own music. Again, that was transformative. It happens once every generation or so. The third kind of innovation happens every hour, and that is taking something that works over there and putting it over here. This is what every company in the world does, every government in the world does, every policy writer in the world tries to do, every science writer in the world tries to do. And I recommend that that's where your baseline begins, if you're struggling to recommend something that needs to be done. So investigate. Let's say you're talking about diabetes policy in North America or something like that. You don't know what to recommend. Well, you know what? In New Zealand, they did this thing with malaria. What if we were to change the setting from New Zealand to Canada and change malaria to diabetes? Would that work here? Okay. Again, you don't have to be right. This isn't a master's thesis. It's not a Nobel Prize-winning submission. It's something you're going to write in a couple of weeks. Just show me that you've given some thought and narrowing things down to a certain level. The other thing to think about, students struggle with this, but how papers are marked. And Angel Foster describes it the best. In an exam, here is you start with 100, and then everything you get wrong, we take a mark off and you get less. With a paper, you start from 0 and you build up. And so some people build better than others. So you may have a perfectly adequate paper, but it's not like an A-plus paper. You say, well, I followed the instructions in the rubric. I did this, I did that. Okay, yes, but it's not extraordinary. So to be extraordinary, you need both the art and the science. You need to build. And in terms of innovation, if you're not feeling innovative and creative and mind-bendingly transformative, don't feel bad. None of us do ever. Well, I do because I'm a genius, but most people don't. So don't be mad at yourself. Just read some papers and get some ideas and just play with them and modify them and keep on distilling, being more specific. Think about specificity. Any questions about the final paper? I know most of you haven't started yet, but now's a chance to start thinking about it. The look of concern around this room concerns me deeply. No? Okay. Has anyone started? Good for you. All right, one person has. All right. Yeah, so I know you have as well. A question? Yeah.
We're addressing like a convoluted topic such as socioeconomic impacts and social determinants of health. It kind of needs to be like a big picture. How do we avoid bringing the audience to get where we're coming from?
Right. So remember who the audience is, first of all. So if it's general public, you're going to struggle. That's more op-ed writing in a newspaper. That's an art unto itself. This is a scientific audience, so you can presume a certain amount of knowledge. You can presume that people understand there's a socioeconomic contingent component to every medical argument. But again, just only talk about one aspect of that larger deal. Say, if you're, let's say you're going to look at, we need to address, again, diabetes prevalence rate through looking at socioeconomic factors that predetermine it. Okay, you can start off by saying socioeconomics underpin every medical condition known. This is a known fact. It is defined by several dimensions. For diabetes sufferers in particular, access to nutritional alternatives is gated by their socioeconomic status. Therefore, I recommend blah, blah, blah. Okay? So there's an art to it. So I recommend you start early and start refining. Come see me if there are issues that you come across. Okay? I gotta say I don't bite, but I do. But that's a personal thing. So, inappropriate, right? Any other questions? Oh, yes, the back. Okay, in terms of not being too narrow, don't name individuals. Right? I mean, unless you really know what you're doing. So, this minister needs to get his shit together to do this. Okay, maybe, but that's still problematic. Other than that, it's difficult to get too narrow. In fact, the more narrow you get, the easier your job becomes, especially if you're looking at indicators, right? At some point, probably you'll be mentioning how something is measured. Be specific. I'm looking only at poverty as determined by this. Right? And the reason for this is the more you exclude, the less options a critic has to bring to play against you. Because, well, he didn't look at the multidimensional poverty index. Well, he said he wasn't going to. Right? And specificity, if you struggle with specificity, think about from epidemiology, the PICO method again for research questions. This isn't an epi paper. It's not a scientific research paper. It doesn't have that structured research question, but think about the components of it. There's a population you define. There's an outcome that we define. There's an alternative that we define, and there's like an intervention that we define. So if in your thesis you can incorporate some or all those elements, you're probably on a solid path. Some topics from previous years. One that got published last year was can community healthcare workers be used to reduce the epidemic of measles in Syrian refugee camps in the Middle East? Very specific, right? And this person put forward, here are 3 ways in which this kind of healthcare worker can be used effectively to address this problem. So for that, she had to identify the fact that there was a measles epidemic happening in Syrian refugee camps. She also identified that community healthcare workers were useful in measles outbreaks in other populations, so let's bring that experience over here. Zip, zang, dung, done, and we got it published. Another year, a student got this one published. It was something about, how the Greek austerity measures that the EU was putting in place for Greece was going to negatively influence mental health in Greece. And she suggests that these are the possible impacts, and therefore we need to address them in this way. Got that published after some meanderings. So aim for publication. I don't expect everyone to. I expect hopefully every year I get 1 or 2 published if we struggle. But if you aim at that high level, you've got a good shot at it. No other questions? We'll talk more about this every week from now on. So don't worry, you'll have more opportunities to... You don't look happy. This concerns me. You guys don't look happy at all. I'm quite concerned about this. Okay? It's not a difficult thing necessarily. All right, moving on to today's topic, which is my favorite topic in global health because it is an emerging recognition of an important dimension of what we do. Increasingly, I feel that Canada is a leader in this field, unlike other kinds of fields in global health where the Americans dominate. When I go to conferences in the USA, discussions of ethics are minimal, in my experience, and kind of shallow. There's a big conference at Yale every year. I think I mentioned it to you. It's called Unite for Sight. It's considered to be the go-to conference. Jeff Sachs runs it. CNN covers it occasionally. I've been a couple times, and each time I'm horrified by the activities that I would consider to be somewhat unethical. And these are things like all the big schools come in and present their new global health programs, all of which are about the experience of Western people going to developing countries. It's never about how we're going to improve the lives of people living in those countries. It's all about what we offer you, us, as high-income individuals who go abroad. So, and that's in a nutshell the essence of the ethical issues in global health, in that so much of this is contextualized from essentially a neo-colonial perspective, meaning that even though we are encapsulating this in a discussion of how we're helping, we are doing so from a top-down approach, an imperialist approach. It's all about us still. So hopefully this will come through. And what I'm going to present to you is really basically, very superficial level, some of the historical origins of medical ethics thinking, then a couple of theoretical constructs. So we're going to finish with a model that I and my colleagues put together for training people for going abroad, and lastly go through some examples. By the way, ethics examples in global health are valuable. Every year, some publishing company wants to take my examples and publish them because everyone wants to take them. No, I'm not giving these away. So if you come across more of them, let me know, because I'll collect other people if I'm not giving mine away. So I'll begin with this quote here. This is from Ivan Illich, who is a Nicaraguan priest. And I won't read the entire thing, but he says essentially, "To hell with good intentions. I'm here to tell you to renounce your power, which being, in this case, Canadian, gives you. Come look at us, come climb our mountains, enjoy our flowers, come to study, but do not come to help." In other words, he's saying that the worst thing you can do is be a do-gooder, is to show up with intention to help, and if you need to travel, be a tourist instead. And most people seem to think being a tourist is usually a low-impact kind of thing, because usually a country has created a tourist infrastructure for you. You come, you spend your money. Spending your money is always a good idea. But if you come to do good things, chances are you're going to do more bad than good. And we'll look at some of the examples later on. This is an image from one of my projects. This is in Sri Lanka 12 years ago. And I bring it here usually when I talk about research ethics, which is another topic entirely, but related. So when I did this project, it was after the tsunami in Sri Lanka. I was a private consultant at the time, and my girlfriend and I formed an NGO in Sri Lanka. We gave a lot of emergency care. Then we sent interviewers to do a quick study. And the study interviewed young people living in a refugee camp to study their experiences with the Civil War and with the tsunami. Fine. Okay, it came back. The study was quite well received. Then CHIO invited me to give a talk about this. So at CHIO, by that point I was working at CHIO as a consultant. So I gave a talk there, and afterwards I got this nasty letter from the president of CHIO saying, "Nice presentation, but we discovered you didn't have research ethics clearance to do this study." And it's true, I didn't. But I didn't need to do so, because as a private consultant, there's no legal requirement that I do so. Ethics is not legally mandated. Ethics is highly suggested. For research institutions, they need to undertake ethics clearance for the project. So projects that I do here at the university that you would do under a professor's leadership for your thesis, etc., go through. Still on? No? Oh, damn. Bear with me. This is still being recorded, by the way, and now the people are wondering, what's he doing? What's he doing? Sorry? At my age, it's possible. I might have had a heart attack. That's better. Okay, so research institutions undertake ethics applications because it's the right thing to do, but also because if they fail to do so, the funding bodies will penalize them. That's the way that ethics is incorporated into federal laws in most Western countries, including Canada. But I was not required to do so here. I had oversight from the Sri Lankan government, so I'm actually morally and legally covered. But I bring this up to point out that ethics is a confusing and uncertain topic, and just because you get legal approbation for it doesn't necessarily mean you've done it correctly. And one day we'll talk about, if I have an opportunity, research ethics in global health, which is very confusing. And the reason we did not pursue research ethics approval for this project in North America is we know it would not happen in time. And this was an emergency scenario, right? So it's an evolving field. So when we talk about ethics in global health, we're either talking about the behavior of people going abroad to interventions, which is what we're going to talk about, or it's a larger discussion of informed consent and governmental behaviors and the behaviors of groups. We'll touch upon this as well. By the way, in December, I'll send this around, the medical faculty will be hosting its pre-departure training initiative that we do every 2 or 3 times a year. This is for medical residents, medical students, and anyone in the health field, including health science students, who intend to do any sort of international global health work. What we do is we spend a day, we feed you, we give you lectures on people's experiences, and do a lot of ethics training. You're welcome to participate if you want. I'll send around the schedule later on this week, and you can figure that out yourself. So, our story begins decades ago. It begins hundreds of years ago, actually, but in modern context, ethics in medicine begins with the Tuskegee experiment. You know what this is? Tuskegee experiment? What is it? That's exactly right. Good summary, exactly right. So this is how the story begins in North America. But on a global scape, ethics is more complicated than that. But it wasn't until this happened that the Americans started really looking into how to incorporate medical ethics into law and to policy. And we have this thing called the Declaration of Helsinki, which has happened in 1964. Do I have a timeline here? Let me see. I do. All right. So we'll skip through this and get to the timeline quickly. But much of what we consider today to be the guiding principles of medical ethics is informed by the Declaration of Helsinki. And this evolves from other stuff that we'll see in a second. The fundamental principle evoked from the Declaration of Helsinki is informed consent, which I think you've all heard of, and we'll talk more about in a second. WHO has an ethics office, but they don't give direct advice to global health initiatives in general. They only look at the policies and procedures of their own projects. Okay, so for my money, the story really begins with the Nuremberg Code. Do you know what Nuremberg Code is? Yeah. So at the end of World War II, there's something called the Nuremberg Trials. Remember what that is? What is it? Not necessarily. No, not exactly. It's about individuals. Nuremberg trials were trials of individuals that took place in Nuremberg, Germany, for Nazis who had committed war atrocities. Okay, and it's a horrifying thing. There's a great movie about it. It was needed because up to that point, there's nothing really encoded in law that says you couldn't do some of this stuff. And we all know what that stuff was. I don't want to list them in great detail. But one example would be they would take their prisoners and beat them on the testicles until they died. For what reason? Just to see how long it took. Okay, so the question that the legal scholars brought forth is, at what point can we say you cannot do a medical experiment, even if you claim it is in progress of science? What they decided upon was research must have at its goal to do good and not harm. So where is the good in beating someone on the testicles until he dies? Right? So there has to be an a priori statement of intent that is positive. And there has to be, to some extent, agreement on the part of the person going through the process to undertake this. So with that code, we have the voluntary consent of the human subject being essential. This is the core of informed consent. Amazingly, this was not enshrined in Western law until the Nuremberg Code. So after the war, we had the Declaration of Geneva, which rethought about the Hippocratic Oath. Yes, madam?
Is Nuremberg Code universal or just for healthcare?
It was a moment in legal history. I mean, it's not law even. It's just like international law isn't law. It's just guidelines, really. So it's nowhere. That's right. That's right. Okay. So Declaration of Geneva happened shortly after this as well as a way to reconsider the Hippocratic Oath. And you probably know the Hippocratic Oath historically is what doctors take when they become doctors. It has no legal basis, but it's a declaration, again, of principles having to do with the intent to do good and the avoidance of individual harm. Okay. Of the tenets that define the Hippocratic Oath, the most pertinent was, I will not use my medical knowledge to violate human rights, civil liberties, even under threat. So suddenly we're saying, okay, things that we do in healthcare must always be respectful of autonomy and of the human animal to undertake a positive life. The Belmont report in the USA came out after the Tuskegee study, and they was kind of like the Declaration of Geneva was to codify the protection of individual humans, and then finally the Declaration of Helsinki. Okay, we update this every few years, and this tells us the principles that guide our ethical decision making. These are the pillars of ethical research. If you end up in medical school one day, hopefully we'll go over this again. Some schools do it with more vigor than others, but I won't go through all of these. But in general, autonomy. Autonomy is the need to respect an individual patient's right to make decisions about his or her own care. Beneficence, our intent to do good for them. Non-malfeasance, our intent not to do bad things for them. Acting in their best interests. Well, okay, that seems obvious, right? But sometimes their best interests do not overlap with your best interests or with the best interests of your research study or of your institutional goals and so forth. So you always act on the patient's best interest. Keep their data confidential. Be truthful to them. Now, that's a tough one sometimes, especially if you're doing psychological research, because often that requires lying. Anybody ever volunteer for psych research studies? I highly recommend it. Oh, great, look at all of you. Is it required now? Oh, jeez. I don't think it's volunteering if it's required. I think it's a definitional problem. When I was undergrad, I was so poor, I volunteered for everything that paid money, and a lot of research, which is why I'm the way I am now. And one of the things I volunteered for was a study I thought was about survival instincts. So they put me in a room with some young women, and we were told, you're on a plane, the plane has crashed, and now there's a list of items, prioritize them on what you will need to survive. And they also gave us a logic test to do. Then halfway through the prioritization conversation, we told the results for a logic test, and she got 84 and I got 78. We continued on, which is ridiculous because I know I aced that thing. And afterwards we found out it wasn't a test of survival prioritization. It was a test of male-female interaction when the male has been told he's less logical. It's fascinating. So in that case, they weren't truthful. Okay? Fidelity is a tough one. What fidelity means is something like, am I, as a physician or as a medical researcher, going to stick with you through thick and thin? So let's say that I'm giving care in a clinic on the border during a war that's breaking out, and suddenly there are soldiers running over the hill towards the clinic. Everybody else bails. You're on an IV and you can't move, and I'm your caregiver. I'm within my rights in terms of, protecting my own body to run as well. But am I fidelitous to your care that I stay with you even though it may risk my life? So this is a sliding scale of how fidelitous I'm going to be towards your care. And justice is very much a Canadian thing. Well, it's not true. It's not true. It's a universal thing. But Canada and New Zealand, of all countries, really put a lot of effort on weighing justice. In the case of medical research or healthcare research, justice has to do with treating everybody the same. So let's say I am going to do a study where I'm bringing in a new water pump to a village in South America somewhere that really needs water. And I choose this village, and I give them water. Fantastic. Why did I choose that village and not the other village down the road? What's so special about this village? It gets the beneficence of my new technology. So in Canada, we put a lot of weight on making the researcher justify their unjust choices of some people getting more attention than others. And often the reason simply is I haven't got enough money. I got to choose somebody. That's fine. Okay, but they make you think about it at least. All right, so then we have this is the summary of what I just told you about. Mostly, when we talk about medical ethics, this is the full list of the pillars, and these are the 5 bits of the pillars that most of us talk about all the time. Principalism is this thing about autonomy, respect for the person and the right to make their own decisions. So, informed consent. We've all seen House, right? Anyone not seen House? You haven't seen it? You haven't seen House? Wow. Okay, I'll tell you right now. House is a ripoff of Sherlock Holmes. House is Holmes, right? His friend is Watson. He fakes his death at the end. All that shit. It's all the same. It's a ripoff. name? Wilson. Wilson is Watson. There it is. Okay? But the point about House is he's an arrogant genius doctor. If you notice, House, when treating his patients and solving their mysterious illnesses, always instructs his underlings, go get me informed consent, meaning you know what's wrong with them, you know what's best for them, get them to sign on the paper, which is not ethically and philosophically what informed consent is. So Wikipedia says it's a condition whereby a person is said to have given consent based upon an appreciation and understanding of the facts and the risks. So if I ask permission, that's one thing, but have I assessed whether or not the person upon which I'm doing the procedure, do they understand the risks? Can you think about any factors that may confound or prevent them from understanding or appreciating the risks? Yes? Age, absolutely. So young or old, right? Absolutely. Anything else? Language barriers, that's a huge one. Anything else? Yeah. Oh, that's the huge one, absolutely. And that's the one that comes out mostly in global health research. That doesn't happen a whole lot in regular hospital stuff. That's very astute of you. Very good. So unless we appreciate those dynamics, we can't fully convince ourselves that autonomy has been achieved. And by the way, it's impossible to 100% be certain that autonomy has been achieved or respected. We get as close as we can. Okay. So here are some examples of things that are problematic when it comes to autonomy. So, my research used to be around surrogacy. This is where, Western women go to places like India and purchase the services of poor Indian women to have their babies for them. And usually we say that, hey, they signed up for it, they agreed. What's the big deal? The big deal is sometimes these women don't really accept the risks. They're the fronts for their husbands or their families who need the money. It says, you take all this physical risk and get the money. So even though the women are signing the dotted line, they truly have not in their hearts accepted the risk. And the question we ask ourselves philosophically and legally is, how much is it our responsibility as the researchers or clinicians to assess the true appreciation and accruing of the risk? Or is it enough for us to simply have them sign? I would argue we are ethically compelled to investigate to make sure that they fully understand the risks and have accepted them. But in a court of law, they don't. So what is choice? It comes down to is what are people really talking about with choice? And when I give this talk to a lay audience, it's amazing the pushback I get from people who refuse to think about this in depth, especially around something like prostitution. So I'm a civil libertarian. I believe in everyone's right to do whatever they want with their bodies. You want to sell your body for sex, that's your business. It's not my business. However, if you are profoundly impoverished and your alternative to selling your body for sex is death, then is that truly a choice at all? Right? So I would argue that it isn't. And so what we have here then is a tension between autonomy and exploitation. I'm exploiting your genuine lack of a choice and masking it as respect for your autonomy to make a choice. And the same with something like organ tourism. So organ tourism is when we go to other countries to buy organs. So in Vietnam or Cambodia, you can get a kidney for $10,000, which is dirt cheap, by the way, right? And you can argue that you are really transforming those people's lives with $10,000. It probably send their kids to school. That's all that is true. It also makes them a little bit less healthy. They're shortened their lifespan a bit, probably. And so is there truly autonomy going on there if the alternative is death by starvation or poverty? Okay? We can convince ourselves it isn't, but it's problematic. So all of this comes into conflict with business ethics. And I'm off on a tangent here, but one of my upcoming papers is on this topic right now. So with medical ethics, when a clinician gives you care, your best interests are in their heart, supposedly. Right? So if I'm a doctor giving you care, everything I do is about do you get better or not. In business ethics, all I care about is am I respecting the needs of my shareholders? So in business ethics, if I'm negotiating with you for access, like I'm buying a house, let's say, and you've lost your job and you're starving and you're about to be evicted, you need to sell your house to feed your family, and you're about to sell your house at 10% the going rate. That's great for me. It's not my responsibility what your particular personal situation is. My responsibility is making sure that my side is held up. In medical ethics, no, your situation is my responsibility as well. So when when we have this conflict between exchange of funds for things like selling organs or buying surrogacy services, we have this conflict between medical ethics and business ethics. Off on a tangent. Okay, so when we're doing development work with vulnerable populations, we often see the immediate ethical requirements, meaning the need to sign on the informed consent line rather than the larger picture, like the economic situation, like people's stress levels, like desperation levels. So we can't rely on informed consent for guidance because then we're blinded to this tension between autonomy and exploitation. Do you truly have autonomy, or am I exploiting your vulnerability? If I go do a study in your population, let's say, do you feel compelled to say yes to me even though you don't want to say yes? Okay, we talked about this in the past. Microcredit. So microcredit is when we loan small amounts of money to poor people, usually as women, to kickstart the digital. We talked about this in the digital divide lecture. The danger, you remember, is, again, women can be fronts for the men, or we don't know who is compelling them to accept this money. Just because they say, I accept this risk, doesn't mean they truly are accepting of it. So again, the question is, what is our responsibility in ascertaining who is truly accepting the risk? I would argue that as development people, as people who care about the world, we have a strong responsibility. We are not business people looking simply to maximize our profit. Food aid we talked about as well. Okay, if we're shipping boatloads of free food in places of famine, there are at least several outcomes that are possible, right? Locals can try to profit from it. We can undermine the local food industry and so forth. So every global health development intervention has with it probable negative consequences. We talked a bit about ethical review boards. If you're doing research, as I think most of you will at some point in your careers, your research has to be okayed by an ethical review board, and they come in a variety of forms. Some called IRBs, which is what the Americans use, independent ethics committees. REBs is what we use. ERBs exist as well. They're all kind of the same. There's slight variations in how they're managed and what their mandates are. But every time you do research, you have to go through that as a representative of the university. Or if you end up being a clinician doing research, you have to go through one of these boards to represent your institution. You know who doesn't have to do that? Corporations and media. So the surrogacy work that I did, it was impossible for me to ever get access to actual surrogates because they're so vulnerable that no ethics review board will ever give me permission to seek them out. On the other hand, NGOs and businesses and media, they're there all the time. You're talking to them like all the time. So all the data I have is secondhand through them. So there's, is it ethical for me to go through these intermediaries that don't have to go through ethical review? It's an odd question. On a tangent, is the census ethical? It's a tough one, right? So when the Harper government did away with the mandatory census, their argument was that it was not ethical. They had other motivations, let's be honest. Their motivations were political, having to do with not wanting certain data to be collected that allowed them to evaluate certain programs. But they put forth an ethical argument, which I kind of see as being a little defensible. So I wrote a paper about that, and it got me in trouble. But the ethical argument around the census is that it's mandatory data collection that does not have to go through an ethical review board. And if you do not participate in that research, you do so under penalty of fines and imprisonment, which is the worst kind of extortion for participating in research. The pushback is that is societally mandated and valuable research for which we need the data for doing all kinds of positive things. So there is no right or wrong answer. Yes?
But couldn't that be applied to like any type of research ever?
Meaning all kinds of research is societally mandated?
You could say like, well, why don't we fix our people's brains because of better?
Yeah, totally right. I'm with you. This does not make me popular in my field, but I have a problem with the census for that reason. And to go off on a tangent, the census historically has been abused a couple of times in a variety of countries. For example, the Nazis used their census to identify Jews in the neighborhood to persecute. The Americans used the census to identify Arab Americans just after 9/11 for added surveillance. Right? So it's historically been a little problematic. Yeah, in fact, I can figure out probably your sexual orientation from the census if I had access to it. Are you a single man living with another single man in a house with one bedroom? Well, you know. So suddenly we start prying into your lifestyle using data analysis techniques. I'm not saying people would, but it opens a door to that kind of abuse. So it is problematic in my view. Everything I got to say is my opinion, so people will disagree. But recognize that these are the tensions that we deal with in the ethics research world. Is what is it research, what requires ethical oversight, and what is societally mandated. Yes? Yeah, okay, good question. So ethical review boards exist pretty much in every developed nation in some fashion or other. And if you can't find one, and by the way, let's say you're doing independent research and you want to make sure that your research is ethical and you're not part of an institution, by, I think, not by law, but by convention, you can approach any ethical review board in your community and they must consider looking at your thing. If you can't find one, there are now private ethical review boards, corporations that will do this for you. Interesting, right? So there's a scandal a while back that compelled provinces to have their own ethical review boards, and a big one was in Newfoundland, I think it was. They called it the Texas Vampire Crisis. Have you heard about this, Texas vampires? So a company in Texas came to Newfoundland and said, we need your blood samples of your population to do this study, and afterwards we're going to tell you all these wonderful things about your blood, and we'll get back to you. They came, they flew in, they took the blood, and they flew out again. They're vampires. So they didn't give anything back to the community, so they're called the Texas Vampires. And as a result, the government of Newfoundland created their own ethical review board for all research on human beings conducted in Newfoundland. And now the government of Canada has one for research conducted by the government in Health Canada, etc.
I guess, like, where I was going with that question is these are all, like, so if you're, for example, you did your research in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
Is that approved by the Sri Lankans?
I see what you're saying. Okay, so no, not every country has one. Right, and so this creates a great problem with international development work. So we like, if we're doing international work, to get ethical review in both this country and the country that we're going to. If that country does not have an ethical review board, often we can set up a pro tem committee of experts to look with it, or we can get an authority figure there to look at it, or, worst case scenario, we get a senior scholar to look at our work and to write a letter of support to the ethics review board here to say, look, we can't get ethics review in these countries, but this looks good. Yeah, good question. That's actually a huge barrier to doing a lot of development work in some countries that aren't developed enough to have this kind of review board. So I've worked with communities in India trying to set up ethical review boards. So it's picking up steam very, very quickly. So universities there are developing their own pretty fast. Other countries in sub-Saharan Africa are slow to come along. But anytime they've received a large amount of American development money, for example, very quickly the ethical review community starts developing. So in general, if you're applying for ethical review, there's primary data and secondary data. If you've worked with a professor already on independent research, you know the difference. The secondary data is data sets that already exist that you're analyzing, and primary data is going to collect new data. And the two have different kinds of ethical standards and expectations associated with them. And there are backdoors. So I'm going to put on record now, as I'm recording this, some of the backdoors that I've used, which are ethically problematic but legally quite good. So the Sri Lankan study. We went to publish that just recently because 10 years later, nobody cares. Right? We'll publish these data. The problem there is it's kind of hard to get ethics clearance for that 10 years later. So what we did then is we took my name off of the masthead of the organization, and I applied for secondary data ethics permission as someone asking permission of the NGO to use their data. So then my partners wrote me a letter saying, sure, DNN can have these data. That's fine, right? And there it is. Right? So it isn't a perfect process. It can be abused by assholes like me and get around it. Right? But keep that in mind, the difference between primary and secondary data. Okay, so there was a survey of surgical residents asking why they went abroad to do electives. And these are surgical residents from USA and Canada. And they said the main reason was to carry out procedures that they would not be allowed to do back home. In other words, they see people in other countries as guinea pigs. And this is the biggest problem when it comes to the ethics of particularly medical students and medical interventions from North America going abroad, is the standards we have here are not applied beyond. I'll give it one time. This university used to send me out to high schools to recruit students all the time. I don't do that anymore because of a lot of reasons. And sometimes they would send an undergrad student with me to talk to high school students. And once I was talking to a bunch of them, and the undergrad told the high school students, and sometimes you can do internships abroad, and I went to Haiti recently, and I had my medical kit with me, and people call me doctor, so I was a doctor for a week. Holy shit, you're not a doctor. You're like 15 years old. What the fuck? I was horrified. But that's what we're talking about here, is people pretending to be experts when they're not in the field. And I'm guilty of it as well. So I'm a PhD, I'm not a doctor, but I've been called in to consult on medical issues in the field. I'm pretty excited. I get to see some cool shit, but I got to stop myself. I'm not qualified to do this. It's a big problem. So as mentioned already, people have pointed out some of the barriers in getting ethical informed consent. So linguistic barriers, culture barriers, low literacy, blind faith in physicians is a huge one. A big one is a different definition of health. So I'll give an example. We're in the deep interior of Guyana, an Aboriginal community, really jungle dwelling, and we've come across an old man with a broken hip, and we're going to have to fly him out to the city to get care, to get surgical care. And this involves like a 2-hour trip on a boat, holding him over our shoulders on a pole, standing in a river, to a landing strip where he's now going to be flown to the city in another 2 hours. When he gets to the city, he's going to be driven to a hospital. And he's never left his village his entire life. And he's very concerned about if he leaves, will he ever come back if he dies abroad? He says, no, you know what? I don't want to leave. It's more important for me to never leave my community than it is for me to have this problem fixed. Right? So at that point, how do we reconcile that difference in understanding health? From our perspective, of course you get this thing fixed. We'll sew you up in 2 weeks. You'll be on your feet. You have another 20 years of life. It'll be great. He says, no, he cannot risk not being able to come back. Right? So some cultures define being healthy as being with their families, whereas others would define being healthy as having these physical medical criteria that are measurable in your body. All kinds of issues interfere with our ability to communicate health status with other cultures. So when dealing with students going abroad, every student, I don't mean to be disrespectful to students. When I say student, I mean anyone who's new to the field. Everyone begins with an appreciation for the inequities of the world. All of you chose to do this course because you are passionate about helping the world, I assume. Good for you. Okay? And you think that something's wrong in the world and you need to fix it now, damn it. There are people struggling. Why aren't we there now, damn it? You are seized with righteous anger. I call the state righteous seizure. Right? Why are we going right now? Now, after we've had this talk, hopefully you start to sense that maybe everything that we do leads to more damage than good. So now you are paralyzed by your ethical appreciation of your actions. For example, every year some students say, hey, we're going to raise some money to build some schools in this country over there. And I ask them, do they really need you to go and do manual labor? Aren't there people there that can do manual labor? Are you not taking jobs away from people? And the answer is yes. And, I didn't think about that. Right? So they're paralyzed. Right? So righteous seizure, except paralysis, nothing is ethical. I can't do anything. Righteous seizure is something has to be done now. So what I tell my teams when I train them to go abroad is to be somewhere over here. If you don't think anything you do is ethical, then don't go. You have no right to go. Right? On the other hand, if you can get close to being paralyzed but recognize we do everything we can to avoid damage, that's the best state of mind to go and do your work. Okay, so here's an example of righteous seizure. Who knows who this guy is? Obviously it's Bob Geldof. But who's Bob Geldof? Youngins, you young kids. I love giving this talk again to the general population because it creates a schism in the audience between the old folks and the young folks. So we oldies know that he was a failed rock star from the 70s. And singer from an Irish band called the Boomtown Rats, right? And he was on a couple of Canadian TV shows in the 70s as well. But he made famous when in the 80s he saw famine happening in North Africa, and he wrote a song called Do They Know It's Christmas? Remember the Band-Aid song? And that started the Canadians doing their song, the Americans did whatever their song was called. They raised a lot of money for famine relief. Then he decided, well, that's not good enough. I'm going to start a series of concerts. So he sponsored this enormous concert called Live Aid in 1987, I think it was. And Live Aid happened simultaneously in London and in Chicago. And back then the Concorde was still flying, and Phil Collins performed in both of them simultaneously. Raised like $500 million. It was a staggering amount of money that he raised for famine relief in Africa, which failed for the reasons that we've discussed in this class already, because we raised all this money to dump food in a place, and it was wasted because we know why now, right? As a result, we'll probably never raise that much money again for famine relief. And I don't mean to pick on him entirely, but he apparently hasn't learned his lesson, because in the New York Times, just 10 years ago, he wrote about another crisis, something must be done, anything must be done, whether it works or not. If it doesn't work, don't do it, whether it works or not. So that's a classic case of righteous seizure, yeah? Bono? Yeah, Bono's problematic in other ways too. Yeah, he's a little smarter, but it's rock stars in development. They're good for money, but not whatever. I don't want to be that guy, but I am that guy. So Bono spat on me once. I'll tell you that story one day. Yeah, it's a good story. I was 15. He was drunk. It's a thing. Ed Mills? Ed Mills used to be a professor in this department, and he's now at BC, and he's Irish. He was actually babysat by Bono, so we got some good Bono stories. And I dated Bono's dermatologist briefly, just so I can get closer to him and spit on him, but it didn't work. So anyway, Bob Geldof also is, I can't believe this, I'm recording that. I can't put that online. So Bob Geldof is enormously wealthy, and he could actually pay for this stuff himself. Anyway, that's righteous seizure. The other thing that I try to train my teams to do is to think about two models for why we go abroad. And I will call these the humanitarian model and the political model. I'm not saying that one of these is true or not. I'm saying these are ways of thinking. So the humanitarian model holds that everyone is a human being. Everyone has a right to respect and to care. So when we go abroad, we try to respect them as human beings. And I will say to you, this is not how I want my teams to think. I want them to think in terms of the political model, which holds that the rich have shat on the poor for generations, and therefore we, as representatives of the rich, must do our bit to make up for all that shitting upon. Right? And the reason that I recommend this model as a mindset is that it keeps us humble so that we do not transgress in our activities in the field. Okay, so when my teams go to Guyana, for example, we're dealing mostly with Aboriginals in the deep interior who have been affected by Canadian mining companies. So many of the medical conditions that we will see are the direct or indirect results of our own community's actions in Guyana. So I want them to say that we're not here out of the goodness of our hearts to do good work. We're here to apologize for the bad things we've done in the past. That prevents us from being too arrogant, and that prevents, in my opinion, greater ethical transgressions. Okay, here's some thorny situations. How much time do I have here? Doing okay, right? So let's say you are doing an internship abroad, and you show up with some life-saving drugs, but not enough for everybody. How do you decide who to give them to? Luckily, if you're, there are procedures for this. We have this thing called triage. We assess who's most deserving. But the problem here is the criteria you use to decide who is most deserving. Is it who is suffering the most? Is it who can benefit the most, i.e. those who are not suffering the most? Is it who is most important to their families? Is it who is youngest? Is it who is most economically viable? So these are the kind of things that need to be discussed before we go on a mission of any kind, is how are we prioritizing value. It's useful, too, to have local partners who can navigate those ethical terrains for you. This is a very common one. Second one is you go someplace to do work, right? Let's say you're a local nurse or a healthcare educator, which is more likely of health science students. You're there for 6 months, and people learn to rely on you and trust you. And then your time is up, so you leave. Suddenly it's like, but we need you. You made us depend on you. Now you're leaving. Is it ethical to have gone in the first place? If suddenly you're creating stress and need when before there wasn't stress and need. Right? So as a result of this is why we always try to include capacity building in our initiatives. So as we are giving care, we are creating the capacity for locals to provide the same care when we're gone. So the fundamental principle of ethics, in my opinion, is that you are ethically responsible for the foreseeable consequences of your actions, which is why we try to visualize what the impact of our actions are going to be before we leave. So is it foreseeable that if I go and give medical care to this community, I'm going to undermine the status of the local caregiver? Of course it's foreseeable. So again, our teams in Guyana, we show up and we give all this wonderful surgical care. We bring in expensive doctors from Canada. The local nurse is pushed aside and she's devalued over time. So that's foreseeable, and so we fix it. We bring her on stage with us. She comes on the TV shows with us. She's always involved in medical decision-making, so she enjoys the same status that we have. Right? And so if we can't fix it, then is it sufficient to simply do your best? My opinion is not. If you can foresee that your presence is damaging, then you don't go. Okay. Be aware of the legacy of colonialism. So people will defer to you because of your Canadian connections, your skin tone, and where you speak. I'm a brown guy, but I speak like a white guy. So if I go to a place like India or Guyana, where I do a lot of work, I'm afforded the luxury and the power that my passport gives me. So I can actually knock on the Minister of Health's door and get a meeting right away. Dressed like this, dressed like Captain America. It's ridiculous. Whereas a local who has a lot more status than me, who's in a nice suit and struggling for weeks for an appointment, and nothing special about me, it's just I carry a Canadian passport. So I can compel action simply by being a Canadian, and that's a lot of power. I can't abuse it. So for informed consent, it's problematic. Imagine a British male doctor in rural India giving care to an illiterate, poor woman in a village in India and asking her permission to do a procedure. There are factors, that you alluded to them, that will compel her to say yes when she may not want to say yes. There's a legacy of colonialism. The British were in charge of India. He's male, she's female. He's educated, she's not. He's white, she's brown. Everything in that mix will compel her to think he knows better than me. Right? That is not informed consent. That's coercion. Okay. So you're capable of coercing participation by being who you are, and you are even capable of coercing government by being who you are. It's a lot of power. Evil practices. I mentioned elevating non-doctors to the status of doctor. That's a big one. Claiming expertise you don't have. I see it all the time. I do it all the time. It's a problem. Bypassing local rules bypassing rules here by going abroad is a problem. Okay, bullying locals to see it your way. You don't think you're going to do this. You're going to do it. I'm going to move fast because I want to get to an example where this is a big issue. Okay, this is one of the biggest challenges I see in the field and it comes from a good place. It comes from righteous seizure, that I want to change the world, and those people are doing things wrong, and they don't see they're doing things wrong, and I'm going to make them see they're doing things wrong. Damn it. Okay. So I'm going to skip through these because we're running out of time a little bit here. But here's some examples that the MSF has written about. Right, so they're testing blood. They're giving a transfusion in the field, and suddenly they find one of the blood samples has HIV in it. Do they tell people they get HIV? Right? On the one hand, well, they have a right to know. On the other hand, if I tell them, now what? We can't treat them. There's no process here. Right? So what do I do? So that's a big ethical question. Second, you're in the field and someone local asks you to use your equipment to sterilize something to do some female genital mutilation, which I think we all agree is a bad thing. You say no, but then they will use unsterilized equipment and probably cause an infection. So how do you balance this? Right? Do I do harm reduction, or do I participate in this atrocious activity? Right? That's a tough one. Same. I'll skip this one. Right. This is one I've seen a few times. Okay. So do you attempt something that you are not trained to do if no one else is there to do it? Tough one. So I'll give you some examples in a second. By the way, so I wrote about my model for training people going abroad here, if you want to read it. But essentially it says this. It's a 3-stage process. We begin by having an objective before we leave. And the objective isn't I'm going to reduce maternal mortality by X%. It's something vague and aspirational, like I'm going to sustain goodwill such that in future visits we will make incremental positive change. Second step is we agree to discuss every transgression until we get a resolution. Discuss. This minimizes the chances of rash actions. And lastly, to remind yourself that you are not all-knowing. And that seems obvious. This is tough in the field. Okay, examples. This one is a quick one. When the earthquake in Haiti happened, a lot of NGOs descended on Haiti to do a lot of good work, including a lot of free medical care. Okay, however, that succeeded in devaluing the contribution of local doctors. In fact, we drove a lot of them out of business. So when suddenly all the foreigners left, the local doctors were economically staggered. They had devalued in social status and everything. So what should have happened was they should have been part of the medical response rather than separate from it. That's an example of, again, an NGO showing up and devaluing the status of local care, but also leaving a hole when they leave. This one we talked about already in previous lectures, right? The biogas. We'll skip that one. James Phipps, I mentioned in the past as an example historically of ethical transgression. So when Jenner injected James Phipps with the early version of the smallpox vaccine, he then locked James Phipps in a greenhouse and exposed him to smallpox to see if he would get it, and he didn't, right? And his reward was a shiny new coin. But he threatened this young boy's life to test out his science. At the time, this was considered proper behavior because James Phipps was the gardener's son, low class. His life wasn't worth a lot, and Jenner was high class, and he had every right in the world to act aristocratically. Today, we would see that as victimizing the vulnerable. So this goes back a long way. I'm going to skip this because that's a long story. May come back to it, though. Okay, here we go. One of my favorite stories. So here we are in the interior of Guyana, deep in the interior. 2 boat rides and a bush plane ride way in the deep. And magically, in this little tiny island deep in the jungle, there is a residential high school for about 300 Aboriginal children. It's a Christian high school, too, fundamental Christian high school. And one night, we're awakened by a family of a 13-year-old girl who says that their daughter is pregnant. And they need to talk to us about it. And instantly, our team is up in arms, right? And they start talking about smuggling her out to give her an abortion because we know her life is over, right? She has this baby. She has pulled out of school. She's just one more wasted young girl who had a future, doesn't have a future anymore, and maybe the pregnancy will threaten her life. But it's a conservative culture, and she can't seek an abortion here because it's not part of their religion. So we're going to smuggle her out, pretend it was a miscarriage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's the problem with that? Yeah. Portraying trust the community. That's the first step. What else is going on? Yeah? There's no consent. Nobody asked her. It's so funny, right? It's funny. It's not really funny. But this is an example of righteous seizure and this need to bully the locals to see it your way. So this is where our method applied, right? So I asked everyone, let's think about those 3 steps again. We're here to sustain goodwill. Does this sustain? No, it doesn't. If we smuggle her out and give her an abortion, of course they know we did it, right? They're not stupid. So guess what? We just talked to them. What they wanted wasn't an abortion. They wanted to keep the child. They just wanted us to interview the boyfriend, by the way, he's 34, to find out if he was willing to commit to financially support the child, as he was. Problem solved, right? So this was an economic argument that was seized into becoming a medical intervention. It should not have been, right? So luckily, the abortion did not happen, and we think that had a happy ending. This one, though, is a better story. So same community. As we arrive, I meet with the elders. It's a wonderful setting, by the way. We're in the schoolhouse. The sun's gone down. We're in the absolute pitch blackness. And all I hear are the voices of the elders talking at me. And they say, we know you've come to do health education here. That's fantastic. You can do whatever you want. But do not give out condoms. Because they know if you give out condoms, what does that do? It encourages people to have sex. Of course it doesn't. That's what they believe, okay? Now, we know that there is an epidemic of teen sex happening on this island. We've brought, a couple hundred condoms. They've asked us, do not give out condoms. If you do, you will not be permitted to stay here or come back. So fine, we agree. So the next few days, though, the kids are following us around, telling us, we know you agreed not to give out condoms, but really want them. So just give them to us anyway. We promise we won't tell anyone we got them from you. What do? Do you give them the condoms, yes or no, and why? Who wants to volunteer? Yes.
I would say no, because if you betray the trust of that community, they're not going to let anyone in future years. Like, this is sort of the immediate population versus all of the future generations.
Any other? Yes.
But also, if someone
Interesting. Yeah.
We need to maybe have different discussion with elders and
Interesting. All good answers. All good answers. And there is no right answer here. By the way, I'm really happy with these answers. In previous years, almost every time someone tries to find a cheat, says, I know, you leave them in the corner and you pretend it was phallic. There's no way to cheat your way out of these things, right? A decision that you made. I'll tell you what we did. We did not give them the condoms, even though everything that you say is correct. Right? There are fair arguments either side, and our rationale is this. According to our objective, which is sustain goodwill, this would not sustain goodwill. And sure, give them the condoms a month later, they're out of condoms, and they're back doing exactly the same thing, and we're not there to help them because we've been banned. Okay, so what you say is absolutely correct. I'm not saying you're wrong. This is not a right or wrong kind of analysis. This is simply according to my model of ethical transgression avoidance. This is what we decided. It's a tough one, but here's a caveat. So the men come to us afterwards and say, we know you've been put in a tough bind. These kids need the condoms. The elder is a bunch of assholes. Leave them with us. When you leave, we'll wait a couple weeks, then we'll give them out. Is that a solution? Discussion. They're tired of talking to us. How about this? You can tell I'm not a diplomat, right? So I'll tell you what. It's not a solution because what the men would do is they would sell them. So as I've pointed out previously, every new intervention technology becomes a commodity that changes the economic footprint of an area. Much like the biogas scenario, that changes the economics. Same here. If we leave them here, they would sell them. Suddenly what should be a free health support mechanism is now a commodity, and maybe they would trade them for sex. Who knows, right? So we may be making the situation worse. Our solution was to give them to the nurse, local nurse, who is part of the problem. I mean, she doesn't believe kids should have condoms anyway, so we don't know what happened. But the ultimate decision was we will not give them out. Okay, this is also a good one. Got time, right? So this is a real scenario. Community maybe 100 miles away from that previous one. The local tribal language is called Akawayu, and none of my team speaks Akawayu. So we have people lined up to get medical care from our team, and we're giving triage one by one. We come across this old man who indicates that he has what looks like a genitourinary condition. Okay, but he doesn't speak English. So we can't really assess informed consent from him or get a full workup from him. His neighbor says, I'll translate for you. Not a problem. I speak Akawayu and English. What's the problem with that? Anybody? Yeah? Good for you. You say the same thing? Okay, you guys get right to the point. That's great, right? So that's exactly right. So obviously his privacy is at risk here, and especially if it's a penis issue, right? In a small community, we don't want to have to violate his privacy. Almost every time I talk about this, someone says, well, can't you ask him, the translator, to ask him if it's okay if he translates? Well, the translator can lie and say, of course he says yes. I want to hear about his dick. Absolutely. Right? So it's not a solution either. So there is no obvious solution here. I got lucky. I sent runners various directions, and we found a retired nurse who speaks Akawayu and English, amazingly. So she was able to translate for us. But if we had not, I probably would have allowed it. Because on the other hand, if we don't give him care, he will not get care. The next team is coming in months. Who knows, right? So that's what I balanced here. It's a tough one, and it's not an easy decision. Did we talk about this one before? I can't remember what I've talked to you about. The Green Wells of India. So this is interesting. So we have these two wells, two series of wells, a bunch of wells in Rajasthan, India. And some of them have problematic water. I don't say poison, but, not that clean water. And the local population is illiterate, and it's hard to tell them which ones are clean, which ones are not, right? If you could write on the side of the well and they can't read. So someone had the brilliant idea of saying, well, we'll paint the outside of the bad ones red and the outside of the good ones green, and spread the word, red is bad, good is green. Okay? Fantastic. What do you think happened? Something bad happened. Yeah?
Do the colors mean different?
No, the colors don't have cultural context. Well, it's yeah. That's a good guess. No, it's not happened. What happened was essentially we created a social striation. So almost every example I've given you, anytime you have a technological intervention, that creates a social economic problem. Painting a well, it's a technological intervention. So essentially, the wealthy and powerful claimed the green ones, and that meant the poor ones kept the red ones, to the point that essentially they created another caste. So there are wedding ads being put out saying, Greenwell family seeks Greenwell daughter for their Greenwell son. And so problematic, my friends. Do I have time for this one? Okay, quick talk about Paul Farmer. So Paul Farmer is a hero in global health terms, and he gave the keynote speech recently at the big conference here in Ottawa. So I don't mean to disrespect Paul Farmer again. He's a hero to many, including myself. Fantastic. But here's an episode from his life that maybe you learned about in those videos. I think they talked about in the videos I gave you. So when he was in Peru, he discovered likely cases of MDR, tuberculosis, multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. Do you remember this episode from the videos? Okay. Fantastic. You know the story already, and you know that he was afraid to let the Peruvian government, he asked them, can you treat them? They said, no, you've got no cases of MDR TB here. If you say that you do, we'll toss you out. So he smuggled in drugs instead to treat them. So what was he risking in doing so? That's the question that the videos don't talk about. Is that hand? Goodwill, yeah, and what would be the repercussions if they were to catch him smuggling in those drugs? That's right, but also for him, he'd be evicted. And his current patients would also be without care. So he was gambling the care of his non-MDR patients by treating the MDR patients. I'm not saying what was right or what was wrong. I'm saying that was what he gambled. He won. He was successful in treating them all. But had he been caught, there were scores of patients that possibly would have died because they'd be without his care, because he chose to freely break their laws. So I'll stop there. The takeaway message from this, of course, is that there is no right answer. It's just that everything is problematic, and the best we can do is to try to think about the foreseeable consequences of our actions and take steps to minimize them. That is all. See you Tuesday.